Long before cities, before farming, before language was written into symbols, the earth was already inhabited by humans. Not one humanity, but many. The world of roughly 100,000 years ago did not belong to a single species. It belonged to a family of humans who did not know they were related. Across Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and Asia lived different kinds of people who walked upright, shaped stone tools, hunted animals, cared for children, and survived the cold nights beside fire. To a modern observer, they would all be recognizable as human, yet none of them were exactly us. In Africa lived Homo sapiens, still few in number, scattered in small populations along rivers and coastline. They were physically lighter than some of their relatives, less muscular, and not particularly dominant in strength. They survived through persistent hunting, endurance walking, and careful observation of the land. Their lives depended on cooperation in small bands, rarely exceeding a few dozen individuals. Far to the north and west, in the forests and plains of Europe and Western Asia, lived the Neanderthals. They were powerful and broad, shaped by Ice Age winters. Their bodies were compact, conserving heat. Their bones were dense. Their grip was strong enough to thrust heavy spears into large animals at close distance. They understood their environment intimately, hunting mammoths, bison, and giant deer across harsh landscapes where winter could last most of the year. Further east, in the mountains and valleys of Asia, lived another group now known as Denisovans. Little remains of them except fragments of bone and DNA traces carried by modern people today. Yet evidence suggests they thrived across vast territories, adapting to cold highlands and forests. They were not primitive wanderers, but successful inhabitants of difficult climates. In isolated regions, remnants of older humans still persisted. Descendants of Homo erectus survived in pockets of Southeast Asia, continuing a lineage that had existed for over 1 million years. They had once been the great explorers of the human world, spreading across continents long before any other human species followed. At this time, the Earth was unstable. The Ice Age was not a single frozen era, but a cycle of changing climates. Warm periods allowed forests to expand, cold periods replaced them with dry grasslands and frozen tundra. Rivers shifted, coastlines moved, entire hunting grounds vanished within generations. Survival required constant adaptation. Food was not guaranteed. A herd might migrate and never return. A drought might kill edible plants across an entire valley. A severe winter could starve even the strongest hunters. No species lived comfortably. Every human group existed close to extinction, always balancing on the edge between growth and disappearance. Yet they did not live alone. Each species occupied territories that often overlapped. Migration routes crossed. Water sources were shared. Hunting lands shifted with the seasons. When one group followed animals, they sometimes found others already there. The first encounters were not meetings between strangers who could explain themselves. They were moments of sudden recognition. Another group standing across a valley, another fire seen at night where none should be, footprints beside a river that were almost, but not quite like your own. To one species, the other would look familiar but unsettling. Faces shaped differently, bodies heavier or taller. Sounds of communication that carried patterns but not understanding. Close enough to recognize intention, far enough to prevent trust. At first, these encounters may have ended in distance. Groups avoided each other. There was little reason to fight when land was vast and populations were low. But climate would change that balance. As the environment shifted, habitable land shrank and expanded unpredictably. During colder periods, forests retreated and open steppe replaced them. Water became scarce. Animals concentrated around limited grazing zones. Every hunting territory became valuable. Competition did not begin as organized war. It began as presence. One group arriving to find another already hunting. One group discovering their prey driven away. One group forced to travel further for food. The pressure built slowly across thousands of years. Neanderthals had advantages in strength and cold endurance. They could bring down large animals with powerful thrusting spears. They understood seasonal movement patterns and survived brutal winters. Yet their populations remained small and localized, tied closely to familiar environments. Sapiens possessed different traits. They were less specialized, less physically adapted to cold, and not dominant hunters individually, but they moved further. They experimented with new foods. They formed flexible alliances beyond immediate family. Their survival depended on sharing knowledge rather than relying solely on physical capability. Where a Neanderthal group might remain within known territory, sapiens were more likely to explore beyond it, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes curiosity. Over generations, this tendency would change the world. But at the time, none of the species understood what was beginning. There was no awareness of history being written, only immediate survival. Children were born into landscapes already claimed. Elders taught the young where to find water and which paths were safe. Every group believed the land they walked had always belonged to them. Every group depended on that belief to endure. Occasionally, they would hear unfamiliar calls echoing across hills. Occasionally, they would find carcasses butchered in unfamiliar ways. Occasionally, they would discover abandoned camps still warm from recent departure. These were the first signs that the world was shared. For thousands of generations, the balance held. Humans of different kinds lived across the same planet, rarely forming lasting peace, rarely eliminating each other entirely. The distances between them were wide enough to prevent total conflict, but close enough to prevent isolation. This fragile coexistence would not last. climate instability intensified. Dry seasons lengthened, cold periods deepened, populations shifted in search of survival, movement increased, and with movement came contact. In Africa, a small population of sapiens began to change, not physically but behaviorally. Their tools diversified, their cooperation expanded beyond immediate relatives. Knowledge began to accumulate rather than vanish each generation. They were still one species among many, still vulnerable, still insignificant in number. Yet within them existed a difference that would transform every encounter that followed. The world still held many humans, but soon it would not. As climate shifted and resources tightened, distance between human groups became harder to maintain. For thousands of years, separation had preserved a fragile balance. Now that balance weakened. The land itself forced movement. In eastern Africa, rains began to fail in cycles longer than any living memory. Grasslands dried and lakes shrank. Herds of animals that once followed predictable seasonal paths began wandering further, seeking new grazing grounds. The people who depended on them had little choice but to follow. Movement was dangerous. A hunting band leaving familiar territory entered uncertainty. Every hill could hide predators. Every river crossing could trap them. Yet a greater danger existed in staying behind. Without animals, without water, a group would slowly starve. So families gathered tools, carried children, and walked. These migrations were not single journeys. They were generations of slow expansion. A few days beyond known land, then a few more seasons. Camps became temporary homes, and temporary homes became remembered places. Over time, paths extended beyond the horizon known to their ancestors. Eventually, some groups reached regions where signs of life already existed. A footprint beside a stream that was human, yet shaped differently. Not the long, narrow form they knew, but broader, deeper impressions pressed into the mud. Ash scattered near stones in a pattern not made by their own fire building. Bones cracked open in unfamiliar ways. At first they hesitated. Hunters approached cautiously, observing from distance. The others were not animals. Their movements carried intention, cooperation, awareness. They organized around the fire just as they did. They cared for young. They watched the dark. Recognition came before understanding. These early encounters rarely began with immediate violence. Small populations meant survival depended on avoiding unnecessary injury. A single wound could become infection. Losing even one adult weakened the group. So both sides watched, learned, and sometimes withdrew. For a time, coexistence occurred through avoidance. But avoidance could not always continue. Rivers narrowed into crossings both needed. Migrating herds attracted multiple groups simultaneously. During harsh winters or droughts, there were no alternative hunting grounds. The first confrontations likely came not as battles, but as disputes over carcasses. Imagine a recently killed animal lying between two approaching groups. Each knew the effort required to hunt. Each needed the food. Neither could easily abandon it. Gestures replaced words, raised arms, thrown stones. Loud shouts meant to intimidate rather than kill. Sometimes one side retreated, sometimes neither did. In those moments, the difference between species became clear. Neanderthals were physically formidable at close range. Their hunting methods relied on strength and precision. When forced into confrontation, they could drive rivals away through sheer presence. Sapiens responded differently. Rather than rushing forward, they circled. They stayed beyond immediate reach, throwing projectiles from distance. They relied on numbers and coordination rather than individual power. These were not organized wars. They were patterns repeated across generations. Small injuries accumulated, fear accumulated, knowledge accumulated. Children grew hearing warnings about others who looked almost human but were not safe. Camps were chosen with greater care. Night watches became more alert. Sometimes encounters ended without conflict. Occasionally, the groups shared space briefly, separated by cautious distance. But trust never developed. Communication lacked shared structure. Intentions were interpreted as threat. Even when violence did not occur, competition did. Hunting grounds used by one species reduced resources for the other. A herd driven away by one group left nothing for the next. The environment could not support both indefinitely when conditions worsened. Over many seasons, one subtle pattern began appearing. Sapiens groups expanded their territory faster. They were not stronger hunters individually. They often failed at large prey hunts that Neanderthals executed successfully. But they attempted more often. They used lighter projectiles, allowing safer distance. They explored unfamiliar terrain more readily. When an area no longer supported them, they moved rather than remain bound to tradition. Neanderthal groups, highly adapted to specific regions, depended deeply on local knowledge. Their expertise was immense, but localized. When resources collapsed in that territory, adapting required generations. Sapiens, less specialized, shifted habits quicker. They ate broader diets. Fish, shellfish, smaller animals, plant foods others ignored. This flexibility allowed them to survive in marginal zones between prime habitats. These marginal zones became corridors of expansion. Over thousands of years, waves of sapiens slowly reached the Middle East. There they met Neanderthals more frequently. The overlap intensified. Archaeological layers show alternating occupation of caves, sometimes separated by only short time spans. One season, Neanderthals used a shelter. Later, sapiens used the same shelter. Evidence suggests neither permanently dominated yet, but the turnover increased. With proximity came familiarity, and with familiarity came structured hostility. Sapiens learned the habits of their rivals, when they hunted, where they rested, which animals they targeted. Knowledge passed through storytelling. Unlike simple warnings, these stories preserved memory beyond a single lifetime. A young hunter could know the behavior of another species he had never seen, simply because elders remembered. This changed encounters fundamentally. Now, confrontations were not spontaneous. They were anticipated. Groups approached, contested areas prepared, weapons carried ready, scouts moved ahead, fires were placed strategically at night. The land itself began to feel divided, though no borders existed. Fear shaped decisions. If a rival group appeared stronger, avoidance still occurred. But if opportunity appeared favorable, intimidation increased. Over generations, intimidation sometimes turned lethal. A thrown spear striking further than expected, a chase lasting longer than intended, a group refusing to retreat when outnumbered. There was no declaration of war. No moment where both sides understood a conflict had begun. Instead, survival pressure transformed cautious coexistence into consistent opposition. The humans of Earth had begun competing not only against predators, climate, and hunger, but against each other. Neither species sought extinction of the other consciously. Each simply attempted to live. Yet every successful season for one group reduced the chance of survival for another. Across thousands of years, these countless small confrontations accumulated into something larger than any individual could perceive. The ancient war had no single battlefield. It was the land itself. The movement out of Africa did not happen as a single migration. There was no moment when a tribe gathered and chose to leave forever. Instead, it unfolded through countless small decisions made by people who never knew they were part of something historic. A hunting band followed animals further than usual. A drought forced families toward unfamiliar rivers. A group split after disagreement, and one half settled in a new valley. Each step was ordinary. Together, they formed a wave. The land beyond Africa was harsher and less forgiving than the environments many sapiens had known. Nights were colder, winters lasted longer. The pattern of plants changed, and familiar foods were not always present. Those who survived were not necessarily the strongest, but those willing to change habits. Some groups perished early, others adapted. The first regions reached were the eastern Mediterranean and surrounding territories. Here lived Neanderthals, who had already mastered survival across shifting climates. They knew the seasonal winds, the safe shelters, and the paths animals followed through narrow corridors of land. When sapiens entered these regions, they entered a landscape already understood by another intelligence. Evidence from archaeological layers suggests repeated cycles. Sapiens appeared, remained for some generations and vanished. Then Neanderthals returned. Later, sapiens appeared again. Neither could immediately dominate the other. This pattern reveals something important. Early sapiens were not yet superior survivors in every environment. They struggled in colder regions and often retreated when conditions worsened. But each return lasted slightly longer than the previous one. Knowledge accumulated. Tools changed gradually. Stone blades became more standardized. Points grew sharper and lighter. Some were shaped specifically for throwing rather than thrusting. This allowed hunters to strike from safer distances, reducing injury risk. Distance mattered. Neanderthal hunting required close contact with large animals. Their skeletons show repeated trauma, similar to injuries seen in modern rodeo riders. They faced their prey directly, using power and precision. It was effective but dangerous. Sapiens adopted persistence and range. They harassed animals, exhausting them. They attacked repeatedly rather than delivering a single decisive blow. These methods required coordination and communication more than raw strength. The same strategy began appearing in encounters between species. Rather than approaching rival groups directly, sapiens observed and waited. They moved camps frequently. They watched water sources from elevated ground. They learned to predict movement patterns. This was not planned warfare, but it resembled strategy. Generations grew up understanding that survival depended on anticipation. A child learned not only where to hunt, but how to recognize another group's presence days before meeting them. Broken branches, disturbed soil, distant smoke. The land became readable. As sapiens' populations slowly increased, so did their need for territory. Larger social networks meant more mouths to feed. When resources were abundant, this caused little tension. During scarcity, expansion was unavoidable. Some encounters remained peaceful avoidance. Others escalated quickly. A lone hunter separated from his group might never return. A small camp discovered near contested water might be abandoned in haste. Skeletal remains from certain regions show injuries inconsistent with hunting accidents, including wounds delivered from distance. None of these incidents were recorded. No memory survives of individual conflicts. But the pattern appears repeatedly across regions as sapiens expanded. Meanwhile, climate continued fluctuating. Cold phases intensified. Forests shrank, replaced by open steppe and dry plains. Animals migrated further and in greater numbers along narrow corridors. These corridors forced species together repeatedly. In such places, neutrality became impossible. Neanderthals defended familiar hunting routes. They depended on knowledge of terrain passed across generations. Losing a territory meant losing survival advantage. Sapiens depended less on fixed territories and more on adaptability. If driven away from one region, they explored another. Over time, this mobility gave them a subtle advantage. They were harder to eliminate completely. The difference was not immediate victory, but persistence. A Neanderthal group displaced might struggle to adapt to unknown terrain. A sapiens group displaced might already have scouts exploring alternatives. Their survival strategy accepted movement as normal rather than desperate. Across centuries, this created a slow, directional change. Sapiens appeared in more places more often. Neanderthal presence became fragmented, concentrated in strongholds where their knowledge remained unmatched. The conflict was not constant fighting, it was pressure. Every season animals grew scarcer, where multiple groups hunted. Every winter shelters became contested. Each successful year for one population reduced opportunity for another. Children born into this world inherited tension as normal life. They did not remember peaceful separation because they had never known it. Rival humans existed as a fact of nature, like storms or predators. In some regions, evidence suggests brief coexistence to lasting generations. They occupied neighboring territories without immediate disappearance of one side. But these situations rarely remained stable for long. Eventually, climate, food shortage, or population increase shifted balance. The expanding horizon of sapiens continued. By the time several thousand years had passed, their presence stretched across vast distances from Africa into Western Asia. Each migration wave carried not only people, but memory. Techniques learned in one region spread to another through shared stories and imitation. The knowledge network of sapiens extended beyond geography. Where Neanderthals adapted locally, sapiens adapted collectively across distance. A tool design invented far away might eventually appear in another group through gradual exchange between neighboring bands. This invisible connection altered survival odds. The ancient war was not fought by armies, but by systems. One species depended on individual group mastery, the other depended on cumulative learning. As long as environments remained stable, mastery held advantage, but stability was ending. Another cold phase approached, harsher than before. Habitats would shrink again, competition would intensify again, and the next encounters would not resemble the first. As the climate cooled again, the land itself began to shape the encounters between human species. Forests retreated under longer winters and drier summers. Vast stretches of open grassland spread across regions that once offered many separate hunting grounds. Water sources shrank into fewer rivers and lakes. Survival routes narrowed. Animals responded first. Herds that once dispersed across wide territories now traveled concentrated paths between feeding areas and water. These migration corridors became lifelines not just for prey, but for the humans who depended on them. Where animals moved, humans followed. The problem was simple. There were now fewer places to live, and every group knew it. In earlier times, Two human populations might pass within a day's travel and never meet. Now they arrived at the same river bend, the same valley pass, the same seasonal grazing basin. The environment forced proximity repeatedly. Archaeological sites show layers of occupation alternating rapidly. One group used a shelter, left, and another arrived shortly after. Sometimes signs of hurried departure appear, tools abandoned, fires extinguished quickly, food remains left uneaten. These were not peaceful exchanges, they were withdrawals under pressure. In certain locations, both species returned again and again across generations. Neither permanently claimed the site, but neither avoided it. The resource was too important. This created a pattern of constant tension. Every arrival carried uncertainty. Groups approached cautiously, sending individuals ahead to observe before exposing the entire band. Scouts became essential. The ability to detect others at distance meant survival. Sapiens excelled at this behavior. They spread out when traveling, maintaining visual contact across wider spacing. Signals passed quickly through gestures and sound patterns. Information moved through the group faster than immediate sight alone allowed. Neanderthals, adapted to ambush hunting and close cooperation, tended to move more compactly. This worked well against animals, but gave less warning against distant observers. When encounters occurred in open terrain, sapiens often detected them first. Detection changed outcomes. If the opposing group was small, intimidation could drive them away before conflict. If large, avoidance occurred early enough to preserve safety. Over time, anticipation reduced risk, but the land did not always allow distance. Narrow valleys forced passage along predictable routes. Cliffs and rivers limited escape paths. During migration seasons, several groups could converge within hours of each other. Here, confrontation became unavoidable. Weapons differed in use, even when similar in form. Both species crafted stone points and wooden shafts, yet their application diverged. Neanderthals favored heavy thrusting spears used at close range during coordinated attacks on large prey. These weapons were devastating within reach, but required proximity. Sapiens increasingly used lighter projectiles thrown from a distance. Individually, they caused less immediate damage, but collectively they changed engagement. Injury could occur before direct contact. A group could weaken another without entering grappling range. In tight corridors, this distinction mattered. Evidence from some skeletal remains suggests impacts delivered from angles consistent with thrown weapons, not proof of organized battle, but consistent with conflict occurring at range rather than collision. The psychological effect was as important as the physical one. A group injured before closing distance might withdraw rather than risk further harm. Over generations, patterns of confrontation began favoring those who could impose cost without equal exposure. Still, Neanderthals retained strongholds. Caves in colder regions suited their bodies and hunting methods. In these territories they remained dominant. Sapiens entering harsh winters without preparation often failed to survive. Their advantage was not universal, yet movement continued. As populations grew slowly, even small increases demanded more food. A few additional families required expansion of hunting territory. Expansion meant entering zones previously avoided. Gradually, sapiens groups became more familiar with landscapes beyond their ancestral range. They learned seasonal variations, plant cycles, and animal behavior in colder climates. Knowledge reduced disadvantage. At the same time, Neanderthal populations remained relatively small and regionally isolated. When harsh seasons reduced their numbers, recovery took long periods. Loss of even a few adults affected group stability. Sapiens' social structure buffered such losses. Wider alliances allowed temporary merging of groups during hardship. Individuals could join relatives in nearby bands. Information and support extended beyond immediate family. This difference did not immediately eliminate Neanderthals, but it changed resilience. In years of abundance, both species survived. In years of scarcity, flexibility mattered more than strength. Repeated cycles of hardship gradually reduced territories where Neanderthals could recover fully. Children growing within sapiens communities inherited not only survival skills, but accumulated experience of many environments. Stories described distant lands, dangerous encounters, and successful strategies. These were not myths for entertainment. They were practical memory storage. The group mind extended beyond individuals. Across generations, this allowed planning beyond immediate season. Camps were positioned with escape routes in mind. Travel avoided predictable choke points during dangerous times. Encounters became less accidental and more managed. Yet, conflict never vanished. In some narrow valleys, archaeological evidence shows sudden disappearance of one population after long presence. Not necessarily a massacre, but an irreversible departure. A group displaced at the wrong season might never find suitable territory again. Extinction did not require killing every individual. It required removing the conditions for survival. The narrow corridors of the world amplified every decision. A successful hunt for one group meant hunger for another. A defended shelter meant exposure to winter for rivals. A driven herd meant empty land behind it. Across thousands of years, such pressures accumulated. The ancient war was not fought for conquest, it was fought for continuity. Each species acted only to preserve itself, yet preservation of one steadily limited the future of the other. The corridors grew colder, and soon an event far beyond human control would compress the world even further. For thousands of years, survival depended mostly on physical adaptation. Strength, endurance, resistance to cold, knowledge of local terrain. Every human species possessed these in different combinations, shaped by their environment. Yet among the sapiens, something began to shift that was not easily seen in bone or muscle. It appeared first in small details. Stone tools became more consistent in shape. Instead of each individual shaping a point differently, groups began producing nearly identical blades. This required instruction precise enough that another person could reproduce the exact form. The skill was no longer only personal experience, it was shared understanding. Fire use changed as well. Rather than simply maintaining flame, some groups prepared hearths in organized spaces within camps, cooking areas separated from sleeping areas, waste discarded in particular locations. Camps showed structure. Structure required communication beyond immediate signals. All human species communicated. Calls, gestures, and learned sounds existed long before sapiens left Africa, but sapiens' communication expanded in complexity. Sounds carried layered meaning, capable of describing things not present in the moment. A hunter could explain where animals would be tomorrow, not just where they were now. This ability altered planning. Before a hunt, individuals could assign roles. Some would drive animals, others would wait in specific positions, others would prepare tools in advance. The success of the group depended on shared expectation rather than improvisation. At first, this improved hunting efficiency, but gradually the same capacity extended to encounters with other humans. A group could now describe rivals they had seen days earlier. They could explain numbers, movement patterns, strengths and weaknesses. Even those who had never witnessed the encounter personally could prepare. Memory extended across individuals and across time. Neanderthals also cared for injured members and showed signs of social bonds, but their communication appears to have remained focused on immediate context. Their survival knowledge was deep, yet localized. They mastered what they directly experienced. Sapiens began mastering what they were told. Stories carried information beyond a single lifetime. An elder could describe dangerous locations remembered from youth. A traveler could share knowledge of distant valleys. Through repeated telling, useful patterns remained, while irrelevant details faded. This process created collective intelligence. The effects were subtle but powerful. When entering new territory, sapiens did not begin from zero understanding. They carried accumulated strategies: how to test unfamiliar plants, how to track unknown animals cautiously, how to retreat safely if confronted. Encounters with other humans became part of this shared memory. Children learned caution around unfamiliar footprints before ever seeing their owners. They learned which signs meant danger and which meant absence. Fear became informed rather than reactive. As these communication skills improved, social groups grew slightly larger. Larger groups required more coordination, but provided more security. Night watches rotated, tool production specialized. Some individuals became particularly skilled at shaping stone, others at tracking, others at organizing movement. Specialization increased efficiency. Neanderthals relied heavily on individuals capable in many tasks. Their smaller groups required versatility. Sapiens began distributing responsibilities. If one expert died, knowledge remained within the group rather than disappearing entirely. This reduced vulnerability. The most important change was invisible. Sapiens could imagine situations that had not yet occurred. They could prepare for events before experiencing them. Planning extended beyond immediate needs into anticipation. When approaching a contested valley, they did not simply react upon arrival. They discussed possibilities beforehand. If another group appeared, they knew where to retreat. If animals moved unexpectedly, alternative routes were chosen in advance. The environment remained dangerous, but uncertainty lessened. Such planning transformed conflict without formal intention. A prepared group faced fewer surprises. A surprised group faced greater risk. Over many generations, the difference accumulated. Evidence suggests that during this period, decorative objects began appearing: pigments, carved patterns, shaped ornaments. These served no survival function directly, yet they reinforced group identity. Individuals recognized members of their own community instantly. Recognition reduced confusion during tense encounters. If a group scattered during danger, individuals regrouped efficiently by following shared signals and markings. Coordination improved not through strength, but through understanding. These changes did not occur suddenly. They developed across thousands of years, almost imperceptibly within a single lifetime. Yet across generations, they altered how sapiens interacted with the world. Neanderthals remained formidable hunters and survivors. In familiar terrain, they could outcompete sapiens physically, but they depended on direct experience. Their learning passed through observation rather than detailed explanation. Sapiens depended increasingly on abstract instruction. As climate fluctuated again and resources tightened further, the advantage of anticipation grew more important than the advantage of strength. The land did not reward power alone, it rewarded prediction. The change within sapiens was not a new weapon in hand, it was a new method of thinking. And once it existed, every encounter between species would slowly begin to favor the one who could imagine the future before stepping into it. The growing complexity of sapiens' communication changed not only how they hunted and traveled, but how they perceived one another. A group was no longer merely a collection of individuals. It became a coordinated unit capable of acting with intention larger than any single person. Around fires at night, conversations extended beyond immediate survival. They spoke about events that had already happened and events that might happen: a narrow pass where animals often appeared, a valley where another group had been seen many seasons ago, a cave that should be avoided when winter deepened. This constant exchange allowed preparation before danger appeared. When a hunting band left camp, every member understood a shared plan. Even if separated temporarily, they could predict what the others would do. A hunter encountering unfamiliar tracks could return and describe them in detail, and the entire group would adjust behavior accordingly. This ability gradually reshaped encounters with rival humans. Instead of reacting at the moment of meeting, sapiens began shaping the circumstances of meetings. They approached contested areas at specific times when visibility favored them. They chose high ground before entering open terrain. They positioned observers before committing the entire group. In effect, they turned uncertainty into strategy. Neanderthals, though intelligent and cooperative, relied more on immediate perception. Their methods excelled in close, coordinated action. But when confronted with opponents acting from distance, appearing and disappearing across wider space, their strengths were harder to apply. A thrown projectile required no close engagement. A watchful scout reduced the chance of surprise. Over generations, this pattern repeated in many regions. The difference was rarely decisive in a single encounter. Often it simply meant fewer injuries for one side and more caution for the other. Yet survival across thousands of years depended on accumulated outcomes, not individual victories. Small advantages became large consequences. The development of shared thought also allowed sapiens to manage larger social networks. Groups that met seasonally could exchange knowledge even without living together permanently. An idea discovered in one place could spread slowly across many bands. Tool improvements illustrate this process clearly. A new point design that penetrated animal hide more effectively might appear first in a single group. Over time, neighboring groups adopted it after observing success. Eventually, it spread across wide territories. The same applied to defensive behavior. If one group learned to avoid narrow valleys during certain seasons because rival humans frequently appeared there, that behavior could spread beyond immediate witnesses. People learned from people they had never met through chains of communication. Knowledge became cumulative rather than isolated. This reduced the cost of experience. Instead of each group suffering losses to learn the same lesson, they benefited from distant observation. Such sharing required trust within the species and recognition of belonging beyond immediate family. Sapiens' identity expanded. Individuals began recognizing others as part of a broader community, even if they had never met directly. Symbols, markings, and consistent tool styles signaled familiarity. This made cooperation between groups more likely and conflict within the species less frequent. While rival species remained outsiders, sapiens increasingly treated unknown sapiens as potential allies. This distinction mattered when populations remained small. A lone group facing hardship could merge temporarily with another. Children grew within wider support networks. Survival no longer depended solely on the success of a single band. Neanderthals appear to have maintained tighter local groups. Their bonds were strong but limited in range. When losses occurred, replacement through outside assistance was less common. Each group's fate depended primarily on itself. As harsh seasons repeated, resilience favored interconnected communities. The ability to imagine shared stories reinforced cohesion. Narratives explaining origins, territories, and dangers unified behavior. Even if the details varied, they guided decisions. Individuals trusted collective memory beyond personal experience. When entering contested land, fear was balanced by preparation. People knew where to stand, when to advance, and when to retreat. Coordination reduced panic. Conflict, therefore, became less chaotic for sapiens. Encounters were not random collisions, but managed risks. The environment continued pressuring all human species. Cold intervals lengthened. Drought cycles intensified. Animals migrated unpredictably. Under such conditions, every inefficiency threatened survival. A species that required fewer attempts to succeed endured better. Planning reduced wasted effort. Fewer failed hunts meant less hunger. Less hunger meant fewer desperate confrontations. Over many generations, sapiens' losses decreased relative to their opportunities. They did not eliminate rivals in single events. Instead, they consistently recovered from setbacks, while others sometimes could not. Recovery was the true advantage of shared thought. When a disaster struck a sapiens group, surviving members could integrate with others carrying the same cultural patterns. Knowledge persisted, skills persisted, population rebounded. When disaster struck an isolated group with little external connection, recovery depended entirely on remaining individuals. If too few remained, traditions vanished with them. Gradually, territories once alternating between species began remaining occupied by sapiens more consistently, not through conquest, but through endurance. The ancient war had no commanders and no planned campaigns, yet it unfolded through the repeated outcome of prepared minds meeting immediate reactions. The battlefield was not decided by who fought harder in a single moment, but by who adapted faster across many lifetimes. And as environments grew even more unstable, adaptation would soon be tested beyond anything either species had faced before. There was never a moment when humans gathered in numbers and declared open war. No armies formed, no territories marked with intention of conquest. Yet the evidence left behind suggests that violence between human species became more frequent as time passed. The violence was quiet and scattered, carried out in brief encounters that left no witnesses beyond those involved. Only bone and stone preserved traces. Some skeletons from this era show puncture wounds in places difficult to explain by hunting accidents alone. Injuries appear on the back of the body or at angles suggesting thrown projectiles rather than animal attacks. Others show healed fractures consistent with interpersonal blows. Most lived through these injuries, some did not. Such evidence appears in regions where different human species overlapped. These were not battles for dominance of large territories. They were moments of sudden conflict over immediate survival. A group approaching a water source found another already there. A hunting party discovered rivals pursuing the same herd. In close quarters, fear and necessity left little room for restraint. Often the encounter likely ended quickly. One side retreated after warning gestures, but sometimes retreat came too late. The development of distance weapons changed these encounters. A spear thrown from afar could strike before intentions were fully understood. A wounded individual slowed the group, increasing vulnerability. Injury created risk of infection, and infection meant death, even without further conflict. Every wound had consequences beyond the moment. Groups began approaching contested areas, expecting hostility. Scouts moved ahead more carefully. Fires were lit less often in exposed terrain. Camps shifted locations more frequently to avoid predictable patterns. The land became tense, even in silence. Neanderthals, strong at close range, sometimes responded aggressively when rivals approached. Their hunting style required commitment once begun. A retreat mid-confrontation could cost food during already scarce seasons. Under pressure, conflict escalated. Sapiens, increasingly reliant on coordination, sometimes attempted to drive rivals away before direct contact. Shouts, thrown stones, and distant spears discouraged approach. Occasionally this worked. Occasionally it provoked retaliation. Neither species sought extermination. Each responded to immediate threat. Yet, repeated across thousands of years, immediate threats formed a pattern. Certain valleys show long presence of one species followed by sudden disappearance coinciding with arrival of another. Not always permanent at first, but increasingly so over time. The shift was gradual and often separated by generations. A location used by Neanderthals for centuries might later host sapiens exclusively. The process rarely occurred overnight. Instead, many small events accumulated. A harsh winter reduced one group's numbers. The next season, a rival occupied their hunting ground. Survivors attempted return but found conditions altered. Lacking numbers to reclaim territory, they moved elsewhere. There, they encountered other groups facing similar pressures. Fragmentation increased vulnerability. Children born during this period grew accustomed to caution. Tracks were interpreted carefully. Unknown fires triggered relocation. Encounters were stories told around hearths, not as curiosities but warnings. Fear shaped movement patterns. Yet, cooperation existed within species. Injured individuals were cared for. Elders preserved knowledge. These behaviors show both Neanderthals and sapiens valued their own communities deeply. Conflict was directed outward, not within. However, larger social networks gave sapiens a subtle advantage again. If one group lost territory, they often had nearby allies. Neanderthal groups appear to have been more isolated geographically, meaning loss carried heavier consequence. The silent clashes did not always involve weapons. Sometimes they involved absence. A group arriving at a seasonal site might find prey gone, driven away by earlier hunters. They moved on hungry. Repeated hunger weakened survival capacity. Competition for animals was conflict without contact. In colder years, caves offered crucial shelter. Some sites show alternating use but eventually exclusive occupation by sapiens. Control of shelter meant survival through winter storms. Losing it could mean exposure and death without a single blow exchanged. Thus, violence and displacement worked together. Even in regions where direct killing was rare, pressure reduced numbers. Lower population meant fewer births. Fewer births meant slower recovery from natural losses. Over centuries, this mattered greatly. The silent clashes shaped a new reality. Human species no longer merely shared the world. Their existence began limiting each other's future. And soon, the planet itself would intervene in a way that threatened them all equally. Most conflicts leave ruins, weapons, or graves arranged in patterns that tell a clear story. The ancient struggle between human species left almost none of these. The traces are indirect, preserved not as records of battles, but as changes in presence. Archaeological layers reveal it quietly. A cave, used continuously for generations, suddenly stops showing one style of tools and begins showing another. Animal remains shift from heavy close-range hunting marks to lighter projectile damage. Fire pits move position. Living spaces reorganize. No burned fortifications, no piles of weapons, just replacement. At first, such transitions may have happened slowly, with long gaps between occupations. But in many regions, the gap shortens over time. One species leaves, another arrives almost immediately. The land is no longer empty between them. It is contested even in absence. Displacement becomes the most common outcome of conflict. A group weakened by injury or hunger avoids an area known to contain rivals. Avoidance seems wise in the moment, yet repeated avoidance removes access to reliable food sources. The group must depend on less stable territory. One severe season then causes numbers to fall further. The rivals may never know they caused it. This form of pressure requires no pursuit. It emerges naturally from overlapping needs. When resources are abundant, both survive. When limited, the one with slightly greater flexibility persists. In colder phases, this difference intensifies. Winter length determines survival. Shelters capable of holding warmth become essential. Many of the best shelters were caves, positioned near migration routes of animals. Evidence shows some caves occupied by Neanderthals for thousands of years eventually became exclusively sapiens sites. The transition rarely appears violent. Instead, Neanderthals vanish from the sequence. They did not necessarily die there. They stopped returning. Failure to return often meant failure to survive elsewhere. Neanderthal populations were already small compared to later human populations. A few harsh seasons could eliminate an entire local group. Without nearby allies to reinforce numbers, recovery was uncertain. Sapiens networks again changed the outcome. Neighboring groups shared information about available shelters and routes. If one valley became dangerous, alternatives were known. Movement remained risky, but possible. Over time, contested zones expanded. Rivers that once separated species became shared corridors. Seasonal gathering areas overlapped. The number of neutral territories decreased. Encounters became expected rather than rare. With expectation came preemptive action. Groups arriving at key locations showed signs of preparation. Hearths arranged defensively near cave entrances. Occupation layers containing more projectiles than typical hunting sites. Not fortifications, but awareness of possible confrontation. The silent war evolved from reaction to anticipation. Some skeletal remains show healed injuries inflicted by stone points, suggesting survivors carried memory of violence for years afterward. Those individuals likely influenced group behavior strongly. Experience changed caution levels. Stories of past encounters altered future decisions. Fear passed across generations as practical instruction. Despite this, coexistence sometimes persisted for long periods. Certain regions display alternating occupations across thousands of years without immediate extinction of either side. This indicates conflict alone did not decide the outcome. Environment determined which species recovered better after hardship, and hardship was coming. Around this time, the Earth approached one of its most severe environmental events in human history. A volcanic eruption far to the east would darken skies and disrupt climates across continents. Temperatures would fall, plants would fail, animal populations would collapse. In such conditions, even the most successful survival strategy would be tested. The silent clashes had already weakened resilience for some populations. Reduced numbers meant less buffer against catastrophe. Fragmented territories meant fewer refuges. When the environment struck, it would not choose sides, but its consequences would not be equal. The ancient war, shaped slowly by countless small decisions, was about to face a moment where survival depended not on strength or even strategy alone, but on adaptability under extreme pressure, and only one human species would fully recover. Long before humans recorded disasters in writing, the planet experienced events powerful enough to reshape entire species. Around 74,000 years ago, far to the east, in what is now Indonesia, the Earth released one of the largest volcanic eruptions known in human time. The mountain that erupted was immense. When it exploded, it did not merely send lava down its slopes. It blasted material high into the atmosphere, far above clouds and storms. Ash spread across continents. Fine particles drifted across the sky for months, then years. Sunlight weakened. Temperatures fell across large regions of the world. The change was not an instant freezing, but a persistent cooling that shortened growing seasons and reduced plant life. Grasses withered early. Trees struggled to recover after winter. Lakes shrank as rainfall patterns shifted. Animals responded first. Herds declined in number and altered migration routes. Some never returned to traditional paths. Predators followed them into unfamiliar territories, creating new dangers for human groups already living on narrow margins of survival. For humans, the impact was immediate and relentless. Food sources that once appeared reliably seasoned became unpredictable. A valley that supported a community for generations could fail within a few years. Stored knowledge about the land became less useful because the land no longer behaved the same way. Every human species suffered. Neanderthals, adapted to cold but dependent on stable hunting grounds, found familiar prey disappearing. Their powerful close-range hunting required encountering large animals directly. When animals became scarce, the risk of each hunt increased dramatically. Sapiens, more flexible in diet, searched wider areas for smaller game, fish and plants. Yet even flexibility had limits. Many groups perished simply because the environment changed faster than they could adjust. Population numbers fell sharply. This reduction did not occur in a single season. It unfolded across generations of hardship. Children born into these years grew up knowing scarcity as normal life. Elders remembered better times, but could not restore them. The sky itself sometimes appeared hazy. Sunrises and sunsets glowed dimmer. Winters lingered longer than memory predicted. People could not know the cause, only the effect. Survival had become harder everywhere. The ancient conflict between species did not pause during this crisis. Instead, it intensified. Where resources shrink, tolerance disappears. A hunting ground once shared across seasons could now support only one group. Water sources became essential points of contention. Even indirect competition became lethal when failure meant starvation. Yet violence was not always deliberate. Often one group simply reached food first, the other arrived too late. A successful hunt for one community meant absence for another. The reduced populations magnified consequences. In earlier times, a struggling group might recover over decades. Now, recovery required favorable conditions that rarely returned. Losses accumulated faster than births replaced them. Neanderthal territories fragmented further. Some groups retreated into stronghold regions where cold tolerance gave advantage. Others vanished from areas they had occupied for thousands of years. Sapiens groups also disappeared from certain regions. Their advantage was not immunity, but recovery. When a band failed, neighboring bands sometimes survived and later expanded into the empty land. The difference between extinction and persistence became a matter of distribution. Species spread across wider networks had more chances to endure localized catastrophe. Species concentrated in fewer isolated pockets faced greater risk from each environmental shock. The volcanic winter did not target any species directly, but it reshaped the competition between them. Adaptability now outweighed specialization more than ever. Children grew in a world where stories of distant lands mattered more than ever before. Knowing alternative routes or food sources could decide survival during unexpected scarcity. Memory, carried through communication, became critical. Across thousands of years following the eruption, the number of humans on Earth reached one of its lowest points in history. Some regions held only scattered survivors. Yet even at such reduced numbers, more than one human species still existed. The war had not ended, but the battlefield had changed from contested valleys to the survival of entire populations. The years after the great eruption did not pass quickly. The cooling atmosphere lingered across generations, creating what later scientists would call a population bottleneck. For those living through it, there was no name, only a constant struggle to endure another season. Entire regions that once supported life fell silent. Camps were abandoned not because of sudden attack, but because nothing remained to hunt or gather. Rivers changed course or dried. Herds became so rare that following them meant traveling distances greater than any group had known before. Small human populations were scattered across vast landscapes. For Neanderthals, whose survival depended heavily on large prey, the decline proved devastating. Their hunting strategy required coordinated, close engagement with powerful animals. When such animals disappeared from a region, switching to smaller game was possible but inefficient. The energy spent hunting could exceed the food gained. Repeated failure weakened already small communities. Families shrank. Injuries that once healed now led to death because fewer companions could provide care while still securing food. A single harsh winter could remove most adults from a group, leaving too few to sustain the next generation. Sapiens faced the same winters and the same hunger, yet their behavior under pressure differed slightly. When large animals vanished, they relied more on varied diets. Shellfish along coasts trapped small animals, gathered roots, and even scavenging from predator kills supplemented survival. These foods were less abundant individually, but more reliable collectively. The difference did not eliminate hardship. Many sapiens groups also vanished completely. But those near coastlines or diverse ecosystems recovered faster than those dependent on a single prey type. Distribution again mattered. The bottleneck forced movement in all directions. Groups wandered far beyond ancestral territories seeking stability. In doing so, they sometimes encountered other human species in places neither had lived before. Encounters under extreme scarcity rarely remained peaceful. A water source, supporting only one small band, could not sustain two. The decision was immediate: retreat and risk starvation elsewhere, or confront and secure survival here. Such moments rarely left physical evidence, yet their outcomes shaped the future. Even avoidance could be fatal. Retreating into unfamiliar terrain without preparation might expose a group to predators or lack of shelter. Each choice carried danger. Over centuries, patterns emerged. Regions with diverse resources tended to retain sapiens populations more often. Regions requiring specialized hunting saw declining Neanderthal presence. The cause was not a single confrontation, but repeated unequal reliability faster. The bottleneck reshaped genetic future as well. Surviving populations carried only a fraction of previous diversity. Every child born in these years became part of a narrow line connecting past to future. Many human branches ended permanently during this time. Yet Neanderthals did not vanish immediately. In certain cold environments, they still held advantage. Their bodies endured winters that challenged sapiens severely. In those regions, they continued hunting effectively and occupying familiar shelters. The struggle, therefore, became uneven across geography. In some areas, Neanderthals dominated. In others, sapiens slowly expanded. The overall trend, however, began shifting. As climate gradually stabilized after long hardship, surviving sapiens groups spread again into territories left empty. Their numbers, though small, grew faster where resources diversified. Neanderthal populations, reduced and fragmented, expanded more slowly. The war was no longer balanced. Neither species knew the scale of what had happened. Each group experienced only local conditions. Yet, the collective outcome across continents was clear. Fewer human species now remained than before the darkened years. The bottleneck had not ended the conflict. It had changed its direction. From this point forward, recovery would decide the future. And one species had begun to recover more consistently than the others. After generations of cold and scarcity, the climate slowly began to stabilize. Warmer seasons lengthened slightly. Vegetation returned to regions that had remained barren for decades. Animals reappeared along migration routes that had once gone silent. To the humans who lived through it, the world did not feel restored, only less hostile. Survival remained difficult, but no longer impossible. Yet recovery did not occur equally. Sapiens populations, though greatly reduced, began expanding outward again. Small groups split as numbers grew, exploring lands left empty during the hardest years. Children survived more often. Knowledge accumulated again instead of being lost. In contrast, many Neanderthal territories remained quiet. This did not mean sudden extinction. It meant absence in places where they had once lived continuously. Some groups endured in colder strongholds, particularly in regions suited to their bodies and hunting methods. But the pattern across wide geography showed contraction. The fading happened gradually enough that no single generation noticed fully. A valley unused for several lifetimes might simply be remembered as abandoned. Only across thousands of years did the scale become clear. One important difference shaped this outcome: population density. Sapiens groups, though small, existed across wider connected ranges. If one band disappeared, nearby groups could repopulate the area. Movement carried traditions and skills into recovering territories. Neanderthal groups, separated by larger distances, lacked this reinforcement. When a local group vanished, no replacement arrived quickly. Empty land remained empty until another species entered. Sapiens did. They followed animals returning to recovered habitats. They occupied caves once used by others. Sometimes they found tools left long before, unfamiliar in design. Sometimes they found nothing at all. Occupation did not require confrontation when no one remained to resist. However, in many regions, Neanderthals still lived. There the old pattern continued: shared landscapes, cautious encounters, occasional violence. Yet the balance had changed subtly. Larger sapiens networks allowed more frequent exploration. Scouts ventured beyond safe zones more often. Risk became acceptable because failure in one place did not doom the entire species. For Neanderthals, risk carried heavier consequences. Each loss reduced already fragile numbers. Evidence suggests some Neanderthal populations began declining not from constant warfare, but from demographic pressure. Fewer individuals meant fewer potential mates. Birth rates fell. Genetic diversity narrowed. Survival of infants became less certain. Meanwhile, sapiens' numbers slowly rose. Even small increases mattered. A species growing slightly faster eventually occupies more territory. With more territory comes more food access, reinforcing growth further. The effect compounded across generations. Encounters therefore increasingly favored sapiens simply because they appeared more often. Not stronger individually, but present in greater numbers across landscapes. The fading shadows of Neanderthals became noticeable in archaeological record as longer gaps between their occupations. Areas once alternating between species became primarily sapiens regions. Yet disappearance was not always separation. In some areas, evidence suggests interbreeding occurred. Modern human DNA carries fragments inherited from Neanderthals, meaning some encounters were not hostile. Individuals from both groups lived closely enough to form families. But these interactions did not halt the overall trend. The larger sapiens populations absorbed these rare exchanges without changing direction. Neanderthal identity gradually diminished within expanding sapiens communities. The ancient war thus did not end with a final confrontation. It continued through replacement. Where once multiple human species lived across the world, now fewer remained each century. Children born into sapiens groups grew without ever seeing other kinds of humans their distant ancestors had known. The world was becoming quieter, and soon only echoes of the others would remain in memory and bone. By roughly 50,000 years ago, the pattern across continents had become unmistakable, even if no single person could perceive it. The number of places inhabited by Neanderthals continued shrinking, while sapiens appeared in new regions with increasing regularity. The process was uneven. Some valleys still held Neanderthal communities living as they always had, hunting familiar prey and sheltering in caves their ancestors used for thousands of years. Yet, beyond these pockets, silence spread. In many former territories, only sapiens camps remained. The change rarely came as a sudden displacement. Instead, a familiar sequence repeated across geography. First, harsh seasons reduced Neanderthal numbers. Then nearby sapiens groups explored the weakened territory. Occasional encounters occurred, but the smaller population struggled to maintain presence. Within a few generations, the region belonged entirely to the newcomers. No single battle decided these outcomes. The advantage lay in continuity. Sapiens groups moved frequently enough to notice abandoned shelters quickly. They reused hearth sites, improved them, and returned seasonally. Over time, they established routine use of areas once intermittently occupied. Routine created permanence. Neanderthal survival relied heavily on detailed local knowledge passed through generations within the same region. When forced to relocate, they lost familiarity that once ensured success. Each new environment demanded relearning under dangerous conditions. Sapiens, accustomed to mobility, treated relocation as normal life. Their learning methods depended less on specific terrain and more on general strategies adaptable across landscapes. This difference became critical in the final territories. In colder regions of Western Europe, Neanderthals held longest. Their bodies tolerated low temperatures, and their hunting remained effective where large animals still migrated. For a time, these lands resisted full replacement. But even here, pressures accumulated. Sapiens technology continued improving incrementally. Lighter projectiles increased range. Better clothing constructed from tailored hides improved survival in cold climates. Expanded communication networks shared techniques quickly across distant groups. Adaptations spread faster than environment changed. Gradually, sapiens entered regions previously beyond their comfort. At first, they appeared seasonally, retreating during harsh winters. Later, they remained longer. Eventually, some stayed year-round. In certain caves, final occupation layers revealed brief returns, followed by permanent absence. These may represent last attempts to reclaim ancestral grounds, or final migrations through lands no longer supporting them. After those layers, only sapiens artifacts appear. Some Neanderthals likely joined sapiens communities, contributing genes that persist in modern humans today. Others vanished entirely through declining birth rates and inability to recover from environmental stress. The disappearance was not dramatic. No generation witnessed the final Neanderthal knowingly. Instead, children were born who never saw them, and nothing replaced the absence. The last territories faded quietly. Across Eurasia, a single human species now occupied the majority of habitable land. The ancient coexistence that had lasted hundreds of thousands of years ended within a comparatively brief span of time. The war concluded not with victory celebrations, but with solitude. For the first time since humans existed, only one kind remained widespread, yet survival brought consequences. Without rivals to limit expansion, sapiens would soon reshape the world itself. By around 40,000 years ago, the Earth had entered a new state in human history. Across vast continents, the encounters that once shaped daily caution no longer occurred. Footprints beside a river no longer carried the possibility of belonging to another kind of human. Fires seen in the distance almost always meant members of the same species. Sapiens groups that once avoided each other cautiously began interacting more frequently. Exchanges of tools, materials, and partners increased genetic mixing within the species. Larger social networks formed across wider distances than ever before. This created stability unseen in earlier ages. Where once population growth had been limited by competition with other humans, now expansion depended primarily on environment alone. When animals returned to regions, humans followed without resistance from other species already occupying them. The landscape opened. Caves, once contested, became dependable shelters. Migration routes previously avoided became safe passages. Seasonal gatherings grew larger because more groups could occupy the same areas without conflict beyond ordinary disagreements. Yet, absence of rivals also changed hunting patterns. Humans now pursued animals without competing hunters of equal intelligence. Predators still existed, but none coordinated strategy comparable to humans. Over time, hunting pressure increased. Large animals that had survived alongside multiple human species now faced one expanding species alone. Some regions began losing megafauna entirely. At first, this appeared beneficial. More available territory, fewer dangerous animals, but gradually ecosystems shifted. Loss of large grazers altered plant growth. Changes in vegetation affected smaller animals. Food webs transformed unpredictably. Humans adapted, but the world itself began changing under their presence. Cultural complexity increased alongside population growth. Art appeared more frequently in caves and on tools. Symbolic objects spread widely. Shared identity extended beyond immediate communities into broader traditions. Without constant interspecies tension, energy could be spent on expression as well as survival. Yet echoes of the past persisted in subtle ways. Certain landscapes retained reputations for danger long after rivals vanished. Stories warned children about valleys or caves whose true threat had disappeared generations earlier. Memory lingered longer than reality. Groups traveled farther than ever before, entering regions their ancestors had never reached. Coastlines were followed across long distances. Mountain passes once avoided became routes of exploration. Every generation pushed beyond the last known horizon because no rival species waited there to resist occupation. As people moved, they carried knowledge with them. Tool designs, hunting methods, and social practices spread across continents through overlapping networks of communities. Cultural differences still existed, but they formed variations within a single species rather than barriers between separate kinds of humans. This unity changed survival dynamics. Where once adaptation occurred separately within each human species, now improvement accumulated globally. A discovery in one region eventually influenced distant populations. Learning no longer ended when a local group vanished. It persisted and multiplied. The absence of competitors also altered human relationships with animals. Large prey that had evolved alongside multiple human predators now faced only one, growing steadily in number. Hunting became more efficient as techniques improved and cooperation expanded. In many regions, herds diminished faster than they could recover. Humans responded by diversifying diet further, but ecological balance shifted. Some landscapes once maintained by grazing animals transformed into denser vegetation. Others lost key species entirely, changing the behavior of predators and smaller creatures. These transformations were not intentional. People adapted to immediate needs, unaware that across generations their actions accumulated into permanent change. Population density slowly increased. With only one human species remaining, the nature of survival changed again. For countless generations, the greatest uncertainty had been encountering another kind of human, competing for the same food, the same shelter, the same water. Now that uncertainty vanished, replaced by a different problem. Humanity itself had become numerous enough to shape the land it depended on. At first, the change was subtle. A valley that once supported a small seasonal group now hosted many returning families each year. Animals that had migrated through safely for thousands of years faced coordinated hunting from multiple directions. A successful season encouraged larger gatherings the next time. Success reinforced repetition. Over decades, familiar herds grew smaller. Humans responded, as they always had, by adapting behavior. When large animals declined, smaller animals were hunted more often. Fishing increased along rivers and coasts. Plants, once ignored, became important food sources. Knowledge of edible roots, seeds, and nuts expanded rapidly. This adaptability preserved survival, but it also marked a turning point. Humans were no longer merely adjusting to the environment was adjusting to them. Certain regions began showing repeated patterns. After several seasons of heavy hunting, animals avoided particular valleys entirely. People traveled further to find prey, returning with less food. Communities started planning hunts more carefully, not only for immediate success, but to ensure future opportunities. For the first time, restraint became a survival strategy. Some groups left areas untouched for seasons, allowing animals to return. Others rotated camps deliberately. These choices did not arise from concern for nature in the modern sense, but from learned experience. Exhaustion of resources threatened future survival. Memory now extended across years rather than days. The absence of other human species meant conflict shifted inward. Disputes occurred between groups of the same kind. Territory disagreements, competition over seasonal camps, and access to water still created tension. Yet these conflicts differed from earlier encounters. Communication could resolve many disputes because both sides shared language and customs. Negotiation appeared where avoidance once dominated. Trade also emerged. Groups specialized in different resources exchanged goods instead of competing violently. Stone from distant quarries, shells from coastlines, and pigments from particular hills traveled far beyond their origins. Cooperation provided benefit greater than confrontation. The ancient war had not been fought for dominance in the conscious sense. No species sought to erase another. Each simply attempted to live, to feed children, to survive winter. Yet, the combined effect of countless small decisions produced a permanent outcome. Where survival strategies overlapped, only one could remain indefinitely. Humanity endured because of adaptability, cooperation, and memory carried beyond individuals. These qualities did not make the species stronger in every single encounter, but they allowed recovery after loss. Over generations, recovery mattered more than victory. The disappearance of other humans changed how the surviving species would develop without close relatives to compete with or learn from directly. Cultural evolution accelerated inward. Humans began defining themselves not against other species, but through shared identity and collective stories. Legends of spirits, ancestors, and beings resembling humans but different in subtle ways may have preserved faint memories of ancient encounters. Stories told beside fires might have echoed a time when unfamiliar faces walked nearby valleys. Over time, these memories blurred into myth. What remained real were the consequences. With no equal competitor, humans expanded across nearly every environment accessible to them. They crossed deserts following water, moved into forests adapting tools, and eventually traveled along coasts to distant lands. Each expansion repeated the same pattern: arrival, adaptation, growth. The ancient war taught humanity an unspoken lesson. Cooperation within the species ensured survival more effectively than isolated strength. Knowledge shared widely prevented extinction when environments changed suddenly. Planning for future seasons mattered more than reacting in the moment. These lessons shaped later developments long after their origin was forgotten. The final outcome was paradoxical. Humanity survived by overcoming other humans, yet survival depended on unity within itself. The traits that ended coexistence with other species became the foundation for civilization. As humans entered new lands, they interpreted unknown people cautiously, just as ancestors had interpreted unfamiliar species. Cooperation was possible, but required demonstration of shared identity. Symbols, language, and traditions became markers defining who belonged and who did not. The ancient conflict, therefore, echoed through later history, not as remembered events, but as behavioral patterns. Another legacy lay in curiosity. Facing other human species had required understanding different ways of living. Observing rivals taught valuable information about tools, shelter, and survival strategies. The tendency to learn from others became deeply rooted. After the disappearance of other species, this same curiosity turned toward nature itself. Humans studied animals, plants, and seasons with attention once reserved for rival groups. Knowledge gathered through observation allowed prediction and control. Gradually, this led to the earliest forms of environmental management, burning land to encourage growth, guiding animals toward traps, storing food for future scarcity. The mind, once used to anticipate another human's actions, now anticipated the behavior of entire ecosystems. Within the body, the past also remained. Modern humans carry fragments of genes inherited from those who vanished. These fragments influence immunity, adaptation to altitude, and other traits that continue to affect survival today. Without direct awareness, humanity became a biological union of multiple ancient lineages. The war ended in disappearance, but not complete erasure. This blending may have strengthened the surviving species. Certain environments proved easier to inhabit because of inherited traits. Survival was not simply victory over others, but partial continuation of them through integration. As populations grew and knowledge accumulated, humans began altering the world on larger scales. Agriculture, settlement, and later cities reshaped landscapes permanently. Yet the underlying behavior remained consistent with the distant past. Cooperation within large groups to manage shared resources. The difference was scale. Where once a band of 30 coordinated to hunt animals, thousands later coordinated to cultivate land. Where once information passed through spoken stories, it later passed through symbols and writing. The structure of collaboration expanded, but its origin lay in the need to survive among competing intelligences. The absence of other human species also created a unique psychological condition. Humans became the only beings capable of understanding themselves fully. No external comparison remained. Identity became internal rather than relative. This fostered reflection. People began asking not only how to survive, but why they existed. Awareness turned inward. Art, belief systems, and philosophy grew from a mind no longer occupied entirely by immediate existential rivalry. The ancient war had occupied human attention for tens of thousands of years. Its end created mental space. Yet the mind never completely abandoned its old patterns. Humans continued organizing into groups, forming alliances, and sometimes waging conflict. The opponent changed, but the behavior echoed an earlier era when existence depended on coordination against similar minds. Understanding this origin reveals that much of later history was shaped not only by environment or invention, but by deep memory carried through evolution. The ability to cooperate on massive scales and the tendency toward conflict both stem from the same source: life in a world once shared with other humans. Beneath modern civilization lies that older reality. Every city, every agreement, every rivalry reflects a species shaped in competition and survival among equals. Though the rivals are gone, the lessons remain embedded in thought itself. The ancient war, therefore, did not end entirely. It became part of what it means to be human. When humanity became the only human species, survival no longer depended on understanding another kind of person living beside them. Yet, the mind that evolved during that long coexistence could not simply discard its habits. Instead, it redirected them. Humans continued preparing for conflict even when no separate human species remained. The attention once used to observe unfamiliar rivals now focused on anticipating the actions of neighboring groups within the same species. Alliances formed, boundaries appeared, and traditions defined belonging. These behaviors were not invented suddenly in later ages. They were extensions of ancient survival instincts. In the distant past, identifying friend from threat meant recognizing subtle differences in behavior and appearance. After other species disappeared, those same instincts categorized variations within humanity itself. Language, clothing, and customs became markers fulfilling a role once held by biology. Cooperation expanded inside groups, while caution remained toward outsiders. Yet, this instinct also enabled remarkable collaboration. Because early humans had depended on coordinated effort against equal intelligence, they possessed an unusual capacity to organize large numbers around shared goals. Over time, this capacity produced structures never before seen in nature. Communities planned seasonal movement together. Later, they planned planting and harvest together. Eventually, they planned construction, trade routes, and entire settlements. The same cooperative framework that once allowed survival against competing humans now allowed transformation of the environment. The ancient war, therefore, shaped not only behavior, but possibility. Humans learned to share knowledge rapidly. When one group discovered a reliable food source, others adopted it. When a tool improved efficiency, it spread across distances through contact. This exchange accelerated progress far beyond what isolated learning could achieve. The disappearance of other human species intensified this process. With no equally intelligent competitor to limit expansion, all innovation reinforced the success of the same lineage. Improvement compounded without interruption. The ability to cooperate on large scales allowed civilization to emerge. The instinct to defend territory created division. Both arose from the same evolutionary past. As humans spread across continents, they encountered varied climates and landscapes. Each demanded new strategies. Yet, the approach remained consistent. Observe, communicate, plan collectively, and teach the next generation. This method had once allowed sapiens to persist where others declined. Now it allowed them to occupy deserts, forests, mountains, and coasts. Gradually, humans altered ecosystems more dramatically than any earlier species. Controlled use of fire reshaped vegetation patterns. Selective hunting influenced animal behavior. Later, cultivation changed entire regions permanently. None of these developments were planned outcomes of the ancient war, yet all trace back to its resolution. Being the only human meant every improvement benefited the same species everywhere. There was no competing lineage advancing in parallel. Humanity's story became singular. The knowledge that once ensured survival against rivals now built shared history. Over thousands of years, it produced language systems capable of preserving exact meaning across generations. Eventually, it produced writing, allowing memory to extend beyond living minds. Ironically, the first humans to write history lived so far removed from the ancient conflict that they never knew it occurred. They recorded kings and cities, while unaware their existence, depended on events tens of thousands of years older. Yet, the influence remained present in every organized society. Rules, Traditions and moral systems emerged partly to prevent destructive internal conflict. These systems echoed ancient needs: reduce uncertainty between individuals, maintain cooperation, and ensure group survival. What had once been instinct became philosophy. Humanity therefore carried forward lessons learned before history began. The absence of other human species did not erase the past. It allowed the past to shape everything that followed without opposition. The ancient war was never remembered consciously, but it defined the conditions that made civilization possible.